Mabel Gergan is Assistant Professor of Asian Studies at Vanderbilt University. She holds her PhD from the Department of Geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Before joining Vanderbilt, she was an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at Florida State University. Our second speaker, Parismita Singh, is a writer, graphic novelist, and educationist. Her publications include the graphic novels, The Hotel at the End of the World, Mara and the Clay Cows, a work in progress, Crab Chronicles, and a collection of short stories, Peace Has Come. Sabah Pirzada, our third speaker, who will be joining us by Zoom and through pre-recording, is an associate professor of English and environmental literature at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, a Fulbright Fellowship recipient. She completed her PhD in English with a graduate certificate in Women and Gender Studies from Purdue University. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to the three speakers and Mabel. It's all yours.
Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to get straight to it since I am going to go over by 4 to 5 minutes. I tried to time myself. So, but I would appreciate the 5-minute hand signal whenever I get there. Okay, so my presentation today draws on an evolving project that builds on my longer-term research on indigeneity, hydropower infrastructure, and hazards in the eastern Himalayan state of Sikkim, India. So in this project, broadly speaking, I'm interested in thinking through how indigenous and geological knowledge embedded in a landscape's particularities can offer an orientation to time and space that might offer a counter-narrative to universalist and apocalyptic narratives of climate crisis in the Himalayan region. So this is a map of Sikkim, and you can see this is Sikkim in the northeastern states. The 8 northeastern states are connected to India by like this really tiny this very narrow corridor, which is known as the Siliguri corridor, but also colloquially known as a chicken's neck. And this is the Teesta River system where there's a number of hydropower projects coming up, and I'll show a map of that, where all the hydropower projects are planned and proposed. So the empirical and theoretical framework I outline here are grounded in conversations with indigenous scholars, activists, and geologists, both in Sikkim and North America. My conversations with indigenous activists in Sikkim has taught me the significance of oral histories and mythologies about Sikkim's sacred landscape that became a central part of the anti-dam movement that I'll talk about in a minute. These narratives are replete with stories of great floods, earthquakes, landslides, and also magical contests between Tibetan Buddhist gurus and indigenous ritual specialists that are carved into nearby hillocks. And these kind of stories, that is the contest between Tibetan Buddhist gurus and indigenous ritual specialists, can be found across the Himalayan region, where Tibetan Buddhism spread by incorporating non-Buddhist communities that were peripheral to the Lhasa state. I also had the opportunity to speak with state geologists in Sikkim who opposed hydropower projects and were involved in litigations against hydropower developers on behalf of local communities. Most of the geological expertise for hydropower projects comes from the Geological Survey of India, which is a central government agency that often sidesteps regional geological expertise. Then at Vanderbilt, and I've been very fortunate to have met Dr. Stephen Goodbread, a geologist who works in Bangladesh. And through him, I've been introduced to a team of geologists who are working in Northeast India and are interested in developing a project that brings together geological and indigenous expertise and hazards, particularly mega floods. So I plan on conducting fieldwork in the next year. So what I'm presenting today is not new fieldwork, but the broad empirical and theoretical framework that I'm thinking through. So I don't have an answer to how we can think of indigenous and geological knowledge together, but what I present here offers some insights into how I'm thinking about these questions. So these questions are pertinent given the profound landscape transformation that is currently underway in the eastern Himalayan region. Massive hydropower projects have stilled rivers' waters, while tunneling for railway lines and dam infrastructure.
Can you also place your mic a little bit
Closer?
It's a little muffled.
Okay. So hydropower, is that better? Okay. So hydropower, massive hydropower projects have stilled rivers' water, while tunneling for railway lines and dam infrastructure has left behind scarred and crumbling hillsides. And I just want to note here, and this is an argument that other scholars have also made, that hydropower is framed as renewable energy, and it's framed as a benign, sustainable form of energy, and it earns India carbon credits. So it's a form of climate change adaptation that, of course, is wreaking havoc on local populations, and a lot of you, know about this is what climate adaptation programs in South Asia are known to do. So the screenshot, this on the left, is of the Sivok-Rangpur railway project that is meant to provide railway connectivity between mainland India and Sikkim. Currently, Sikkim is connected to the rest of India via the National Highway 10, so it's only one major highway, which come the monsoon seasons becomes increasingly unreliable, with frequent landslides and road closures. Given Sikkim borders Nepal, China, and Bhutan, railway connectivity and also road connectivity is meant to secure this geopolitically strategic region. The railway lines will pass through 14 tunnels and over 28 bridges across Darjeeling and Kalimpong districts in neighboring West Bengal before ending at Rangpo in Sikkim, Sikkim's Pakyong district. As this news report highlights, the project has violated many environmental regulations and the land rights of local communities. Unfortunately, this kind of invasive construction is not new to the region. It was, of course, run-of-the-river hydropower development that first started drilling tunnels in Sikkim. So run-of-the-river or diversion dams divert the river's water into tunnels, dropping them from a height onto turbines to generate electricity. Despite protests and lawsuits against developers, hydropower development is still being pushed through, and this is across the Himalayan region, across Northeast India, and even Northwest India, Uttarakhand, Himachal, and Kashmir. So even though it has led to land subsidence, the drying up of subterranean streams, and disrupted aquatic life and riverine livelihoods. My research in Sikkim has focused on an anti-dam movement led by the indigenous Lepcha community. So Lepchas claim that they have inhabited Sikkim and the surrounding regions since time immemorial. Many important sacred sites, oral histories, can be traced to Zongu, a protected reserve in North Sikkim. And I'll show a map of Zongu in a bit. So this is a protected reserve in North Sikkim where only the Lepcha community is allowed to reside. Such protected reserves are a rarity in India. And Zongu was given this special status by the Namgyal dynasty, that is Sikkim's Tibetan Buddhist monarchy that ruled Sikkim from the 17th century till 1975, when Sikkim was annexed to India. From 2007 to around 2010, Lepcha activists, mostly college and school-going youth, led a non-violent resistance against dams planned in Zongu and North Sikkim. Despite little support from within Sikkim, including even their own Lepcha elders, their anti-dam movement successfully pressured the state to call off all hydropower projects slated for construction within the reserve. Dava Lepcha, one of the activists who initiated a hunger strike that sparked off the anti-dam movement, told me how in the early days of the movement, he and a group of young activists, some barely out of school, traveled from village to village, trying to convince people not to sell their lands. Through these tours, many Lepcha youth who had left the reserve at a young age due to the lack of educational infrastructure and employment learned of the sacred sites within Zongu and the stories behind them. Dawa explained, many of the young boys and girls, they don't know much about Zongu. They know there is Zongu, but they don't know from which point it begins and ends. They don't know the shape of Zongu. And of course, how many rivers? What are the stories related to these rivers or the lakes and the mountains? Many were not aware, but with this movement, young people have learned these stories. The first Lepchas came from Zongu, the first Lepcha graveyards are here, the first Lepcha marriage, all of this is here in Zongu. Lepchas follow a hybrid religion that draws on Tibetan Buddhism and Lepcha faith and trace their social origins and the birth of lineage ancestors to specific sites, such as the 5 peaks of Kanchenjunga, surrounding mountains, lakes, caves, waterfalls, and hillsides. What Dawa is describing here resonates nicely with what Anishinaabeg scholar Leanne Simpson describes as land as pedagogy, where land is both the process and context. Envisions indigenous people developing a familiarity and intimacy with their homelands, especially young people who've had to leave their homelands for education or other reasons. She envisions indigenous people developing a familiarity and intimacy with their homelands that counters settler colonial notions of land as property and commodity. In this evolving project, my analysis centers indigenous ties to the land, specifically how communities think of sacred landscapes, their oral histories around floods, earthquakes, and other significant spiritual and political events that are traced in the landscape. And here I've also found the work of Standing Rock Sioux scholar Vine Deloria Jr. very helpful. In his book, God is Red, A Native View of Religion, he makes this argument for the significance of sacred landscapes to indigenous communities as a challenge to religious universalism. He writes, and there's a lot of text here, but so in the Western tradition, and I would add here Hindu nationalist tradition as well, what has been the manifestation of deity in a particular local situation is mistaken for a truth applicable to all times and places, a truth so powerful that it must be impressed on peoples who have no connection to the event or to the cultural complex in which it originally made sense. American Indians and other tribal peoples did not take this path in interpreting revelations and religious experiences. The vast majority of Indian tribal religions have a sacred center at a particular place, be it a river, a mountain, a plateau, valley, or other natural features. This center enables the people to look out along the four dimensions and locate their lands, to relate all historical events within the confines of this particular land, and to accept responsibility for it. Sacred places thus inform us of the particularity of revelation, that it is not a universal message to be placed in secular or immature hands for distribution. Rather, it is as intimate as our own personal thoughts that we would never utter in profane ears. So here I'm also thinking of this as an indigenous geopoetics, and I'm taking this language of geopoetics from geographer Angela Last, who is drawing on Caribbean scholars. While many other geographers and humanists have written about geopoetics, I find Angela Last's understanding of the term particularly helpful. So drawing on, and this is the article where she's kind of fleshing this idea out, so drawing on Guadalupean writer Daniel Maximin, geographer Angela Last defines geopoetics as a poetics that takes geographical features and geophysical forces seriously as an element of geopolitics, while seeking to constructively reinscribe them as a means to counter imperialist aspirations and hegemonic worldviews. In short, they represent a materialist, decolonial process of rewriting geopolitics. In his book, The Fruit of the Cyclone, Daniel Maximin looks at methods of resistance to what he terms European geopolitics and its environmental determinist representations of the Caribbean as a hostile environment, given that it is haunted by a variety of natural disasters, such as hurricanes, earthquakes, and volcano outbreaks that destroy homes as well as crops, undermining its ability to achieve true economic and political sovereignty. And I draw a parallel here to how the Indian state discourse paints Northeast India in a similar light, as disaster-prone and politically ineffective. In Sikkim, while state officials have welcomed hydropower projects for their potential to generate revenue and aid private capital flow, it has sharpened local anxieties over land dispossession, environmental hazards, and the desecration of sacred and ancestral lands. Many of these anxieties became a reality on October 4th, this past October 4th, when a devastating glacial lake outburst flood led to flash floods downstream that destroyed the Teesta Stage 3 dam project. What worried many people was that dam developers had argued that this infrastructure would be able to withstand catastrophic floods. But if you see the visuals coming out of Sikkim, the Teesta Stage 3 dam was breached and is completely destroyed. So this is a map of where the cloudburst happened, that is in the Lonak Lake, and this is the lake that in 2021 they had done a study saying that there was a huge chance of a glacial lake, a glof happening, and that's exactly what happened. And that's where the Chungthang Dam, Teesta Stage 3 is located, and a number of tourists, army personnel were like missing, and they're still actually searching for a lot of bodies right now. So for many locals, especially those in North Sikkim, where Teesta Stage 3 is located, And this is also the region that has the highest concentration of planned and active hydropower projects operating in Sikkim. This disaster is being likened to the devastating 6.9 magnitude earthquake that had its epicenter near Chungthang and Zonggu. This was in 2011. So this earthquake in 2011 partially damaged the then under construction Teesta Stage 3 project, but the damage this time around is much, much worse. For the Lepcha community and many others, these disasters are not just man-made or natural, but also supernatural, the clear outcome of the desecration of a sacred landscape. However, for hydropower developers, this event is a natural disaster, even though communities insist that Teesta Stage 3 project breaching made the floods much more devastating. In my research, I found language on hydropower policies describing the landscape, the Himalayan landscape, as uninhabitable, remote, harsh, and disaster-prone. These terms clearly echo racialized colonial tropes of the region as an uninhabited wasteland, making palatable ecologically destructive infrastructures. While this framing allows developers to escape culpability when disasters happen, it also presents a challenge for them. The following is an excerpt from the hydropower policy highlighting the challenge of geological surprises in an inhospitable region. So the quote reads, "Most hydropower projects have been adversely affected by geological surprises, especially during underground tunneling in the relatively young Himalayan mountains. Hydropower projects are located in remote, inaccessible, forested, and often very inhospitable terrain. Obtaining environment, forest, and wildlife clearances can be very cumbersome and time-consuming. Frequent landslides and slope failures often delay project implementation, which in any case is slowed down by snowfall or prolonged monsoons. As this excerpt highlights, resistance to hydropower project is expected not just from people, but from the earth itself. While the policy does not unpack the term geological surprises, it only appears once in the policy, we can infer that earthquakes are not the primary geological surprise that concern developers. After all, earthquakes in this region are hardly a surprise to anyone, including even developers. Instead, the geological surprise slowing down these projects was the encounter with the invisible internal properties of the landscape, its shear zones and underground lakes and streams. The regional geologists I spoke with in Sikkim argued that there is need for long-term geological research in the region. However, given state interest, most of geological research in India has been to aid mining, extraction, and state development projects. When it comes to geology, much like other colonial scientific disciplines such as forestry and engineering, it has produced expert ways of seeing natural resources in ways that still inform present-day state environmental rationality. As geographer Bruce Brown shows, the development of geology as an imperial science in the 19th century opened new epistemological spaces, which in turn made possible new domains for political, economic, and political rationality. This led to the re-territorialization of specific landscapes, erasing existing social natures, and in their place, restaging the landscape as a solely geological artifact. In the Indian context, the Geological Survey of India is attached to the Ministry of Mines and was founded in 1851 to find coal deposits. GSI also provides the expertise for hydropower projects, and these reports have glaring inconsistencies, falsified information, plagiarism, all in service of aiding hydropower development in the region. So recently I was in conversation with a geologist who works in Arunachal Pradesh who told me a fascinating story about these rock formations called the Abor formations. The Abor formation is located in the Siang district in Arunachal Pradesh, and if you see the underlined part, I don't know how clear that is, but it was named after the Abor expedition, which was a colonial expedition raid against the Adi people. This geologist, Carl Lang, said, "The role of colonialism in the history of Himalayan geology is apparent. Abor is an archaic name for the people that lived in the Abor hills. This is where different groupings of the Adi people currently live. I think that Abor is an older Assamese term that means something like hard to control and hostile, and I was told it was considered offensive to the Adi people living there today." The ability of colonial powers to name this rock formation after the raids that vanquished the indigenous Adi communities can be seen as a demonstration of colonial powers to name and rewrite the meaning of a landscape. Geographer Catherine Yusof exposes this relationship between colonialism and geology in her book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes. And I'm going to rush through this. So she kind of is arguing about how colonialism led to a sharing of subjects from geography, kind of reinstating, kind of creating them into a category of geology. And she was also drawing on the work of Dion Brand and Sylvia Winter to point to the possibilities of a counter-geography, a rewriting of the Anthropocene, and unearths an insurgent geology that might interrupt this historical illusion between geography and geology. So debates around the Anthropocene have led to a deeper exploration of the colonial roots of geology and its role in aiding extractive projects that have led to the death and dispossession of indigenous populations and the exploitation of slave labor. However, I'm also interested here in the potential of insurgent geology that might provide a counter-narrative. My conversations with regional geologists, both in Sikkim and here in the US, has pushed me to consider the plurality of motivations within the discipline. And here I've found the work of Navida Khan, an anthropologist, very helpful, especially her engagements with the field of romantic geology. She writes, "The field of romantic geology, which originated both the poetry of nature and the scientific study of the earth, in which the surface of the earth was experienced as an other, but also by one by which to know oneself as another. Even as the Anthropocene seems to further abstract the human from that of a species to a geological force, the specificity of the individual human or community is never entirely lost. The challenge is to hold all dimensions of the human together, as human, as species, and force, and as particular humans." In this article, Khan is writing about how Bangladeshi geologists working on the Brahmaputra-Jamuna River engage in a kind of romantic geology in how they describe the river as both a hydrological entity and the product of the 1950 Assam earthquake that changed the course of the river. So my conversation with geologists has led me to think of how their engagement with the landscape's particularities is both filled with awe and wonder, but can also challenge universalist understandings of crisis in the Himalaya. And I want to close here with these two examples and a brief conclusion. I know I'm above time, sorry. So the Himalayan mountains were a flat shelf below the sea, and it was tectonic movements that pushed the shelf upwards again and again until they rose. So even in the summit of the Mount Everest and across the Himalayan region, you can find these fossilized remains of sea creatures. This mountain building is still ongoing, with the Indian tectonic plates slowly sliding under the Eurasian or the Tibetan plate, causing the Himalayas to rise at about 5 millimeters per year. These fossilized remains tell us how the uplift of the Himalaya has profoundly shaped both regional and climatic history. The origin of the Indian monsoons and the Earth's cooling during the Holocene period can both be attributed to the tectonic uplift of the Himalaya. And many geologists are concerned about how road construction and unplanned infrastructure development will do to these fossilized records. So this image is a photograph of a trace fossil of a giant scorpion. And in this interview, the geologist is talking about how these fossils are very rare and only found in like 3 places in the world, but a lot of indiscriminate kind of construction is destroying these fossilized records. And this is a very interesting interview in Down to Earth about how Himalayan geoheritage sites are under threat by road construction. So if this example speaks to the awe and wonder that the particularities of the Himalayan landscape elicit among geologists, this next example offers an illustration of how geological science that is invested in long-term observation and fidelity to a place can offer a counter to the universalist narratives of climate decline. So some of you might be familiar with Glacier Gate, a widely discussed 2000 report by the IPCC that raised a major alarm by giving a very high probability that the Himalayan glaciers might disappear by the year 2035. The 2035 prediction for glacier disappearance, however, was soon widely disputed by Indian geologists. As it turned out, the estimate for glacial retreat was based on the comments of one lone scientist extrapolated from one unnamed glacier after a single fieldwork visit. These geologists stress the need for long-term fieldwork and observation. In this current conjuncture, we are seeing a rising militarism and Hindu nationalism in the Himalayan region. While hydropower projects, roads and railway building, and disasters are the most visible sign of the current crisis, this is just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. As religious studies scholar Arkutum Longkumar notes that in his book, The Greater India Project, the Hindu nationalist push for territorial expansion in Northeast India is operating by co-opting indigenous oral histories, mythologies, sacred landscapes, and place names as vernacular expressions of the larger Hindu Vedic cosmology. And not going to read this quote. So infrastructural development like hydropower and Hindu nationalist attempts to rename sacred landscapes can disrupt indigenous communities' abilities to read and make sense of their social and political histories embedded in the landscape, much like the geologists who are no longer able to see fossilized records due to all this construction. However, I read hope, and I close with this, and how indigenous communities are mobilizing to preserve their political sovereignty, language, and oral histories, very much in response to these threats. Anthropologist Jenny Bentley, writing about the Lepcha oral history, notes, Lepcha oral history is replete with prophecies warning rulers to protect them or bear the consequences of Guru Rinpoche's wrath, signaling hope that whatever political system might come, the Lepcha will be eternally protected by the saint and will outlive it eventually. In the Indian Himalayan region, hydropower represents both the universalism of climate change adaptation and the universalism of Indian nationalism, specifically Hindutva, that sees hydropower as a way to open up this remote region and assimilate its unruly and exotic inhabitants. The Lepchas, alongside many other indigenous communities across Northeast India and the broader Himalayan region, are resisting these universalisms, making a strong case for indigenous sovereignty and their ties to the land, reminding us that the nation state is a recent invention, but the land and its people have and will persist into the future. Thank you.